Keanu Reeves, disguised as a homeless man in Central Park, uncovers shocking truths about society's bias. In this daring social experiment, the actor blends into the city's overlooked corners, facing cold stares and startling treatment. But it's the police response that will leave you speechless. Don't miss this powerful story that's sparking conversations everywhere. Like, comment, and share your thoughts. It's time to rethink what we believe. The park was unusually quiet that afternoon, the stillness punctuated only by the soft rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze and the faint hum of city traffic in the distance. Keanu Reeves sat on a weathered green bench near the fountain, his hood drawn low over his face. His coat was frayed at the edges, the fabric worn and patched, as though it had braved years without care. Beside him, a crumpled brown paper bag rested unassumingly. His sneakers, mismatched and scuffed, peeked out beneath faded jeans. The picture of a man who had seen better days. A police cruiser rolled into the parking lot, its engine breaking the park's serene ambience. Two officers stepped out, their boots crunching the gravel with each purposeful step. Officer Martinez, a younger man with a sharp buzz cut and a gleaming badge, exchanged a glance with his older partner, Officer Higgins, whose tired expression and coffee-stained uniform betrayed years of service. Another vagrant. Martinez muttered under his breath, nodding toward Keanu. This park's turning into a homeless camp. Higgins sighed, his voice tinged with weariness. Let's see what he's doing. Might not be causing trouble. The two officers approached the bench, their steps heavy with authority. Keanu remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the ground, seemingly oblivious to their approach. Martinez spoke sharply, his tone cutting through the stillness like a blade. You can't sit here all day. This is a public park, not your living room. Keanu slowly lifted his head, his face partially obscured by the shadow of his hood. He didn't reply immediately, instead reaching into the brown paper bag beside him. His movements, calm and deliberate, caught the younger officer's attention. Martinez tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward the baton at his hip. Take it easy, Higgins murmured, though his words lacked conviction. Keanu pulled out a sandwich, carefully wrapped in wax paper, and began unwrapping it. His hands steady, he took a deliberate bite, his focus seemingly on nothing but his meal. Did you hear me? Martinez snapped, his tone growing harsher. I said you can't sit here all day. You got somewhere to go? Keanu swallowed, his calm demeanor unwavering as he replied, I'm not bothering anyone, just eating my lunch. That's not the point. Martinez shot back, irritation creeping into his voice. People like you make the place look bad. You scare off families, tourists. Officer Martinez stepped forward, his tone sharp. Let me see some ID. Keanu calmly set his sandwich aside, reached into his worn coat, and retrieved a weathered wallet, handing it over without a word. He watched as Martinez flipped it open, scrutinizing the ID. The name read Christopher Kennedy, and while the details matched, the photo seemed far removed from the man before him. Chris Kennedy. Huh. Martinez muttered, smirking. What are you doing here, Kennedy? Why aren't you at a shelter? Enjoying the fresh air. Keanu replied evenly. Is that a problem? Martinez's expression tightened. People like you make this place look bad. Higgins glanced at his partner, discomfort flashing in his eyes. He's not doing anything illegal, he said quietly. We can't just force him to leave. Maybe not, Martinez replied, his voice laced with disdain. But we can make it uncomfortable. Keanu's jaw clenched slightly, but he didn't reply. Instead, he picked up his sandwich and ate it slowly and carefully. The tension was palpable as Keanu continued eating, his calm presence clashing with the officer's escalating aggression. Nearby, a few passers-by slowed their steps, their curiosity piqued by the quiet confrontation unfolding before them. A woman walking her dog hesitated nearby, her concerned gaze darting between Keanu and the officers. Summoning courage, she called out, He's not hurting anyone. Why are you bothering him? Officer Martinez turned sharply, his face hard. Ma'am, this is none of your concern. Her grip on the leash tightened. It's a public park. He has as much right to be here as anyone else. Before Martinez could snap back, Officer Higgins raised a placating hand. "Ma'am, we're just doing our job. Please move along." The woman lingered for a moment, glancing at Keanu, whose expression remained calm, almost amused. Finally, with a shake of her head, she led her dog away, muttering under her breath. Keanu watched her retreat, a flicker of emotion crossing his face. He set down his sandwich, brushed the crumbs from his lap, and looked back at the officers. "Am I free to go?" he asked, his tone steady but edged with quiet resolve. "You're not under arrest," Officer Higgins admitted, his voice carrying a hint of unease. Martinez, however, bristled, shooting a warning glance at his partner. "But you might want to find somewhere else to sit," Higgins added. Keanu nodded slowly, his eyes lingering on Martinez, a silent, unflinching challenge in his gaze, rising to his full height, taller than either officer had realized. He adjusted his coat's hood as a strand of dark hair fell across his face. He picked up the crumpled paper bag and tucked it under his arm. "Have a nice day," he said, his voice low but deliberate, each word carrying weight. As Keanu walked away, his movements deliberate and calm, the park's atmosphere seemed to shift. Martinez's jaw clenched as he muttered, "You see how he looked at me? Guy thinks he's better than us." Higgins sighed heavily, already turning back toward the cruiser. "Let it go. He's not worth the paperwork." Martinez's frustration bubbled over. "I don't trust him. There's something off about him." "You don't have to trust him," Higgins replied wearily. "You just have to leave him alone." Keanu disappeared down the winding path, the paper bag still tucked under his arm. His measured steps left an air of defiance in their wake, a quiet but unmistakable challenge lingering like a shadow. As he rounded the corner and vanished from sight, a faint smile played on his lips, knowing, resolute, and unshaken. Behind him, Martinez stared after the retreating figure. "I'm telling you, there's something about him," he muttered, as if memorizing every detail. "That ID looked real. But who carries a wallet like that dressed the way he was? And what's he doing in this park? Anyway?" Higgins pinched the bridge of his nose, his patience fraying. "Not our problem," he said firmly. "We're not here to solve riddles." With that, the officers returned to their cruiser, leaving the air heavy with unanswered questions and the faint, lingering sense that this wasn't the end. The park was serene, the kind of quiet that magnifies every sound, the rustle of leaves, the faint hum of distant city life. Keanu Reeves sat on a weathered bench beneath the shade of an ancient oak, his coat worn and patched, a crumpled paper bag resting by his side. His posture was composed, his expression calm, but there was an unmistakable air of purpose about him. He seemed less like a man at rest and more like someone waiting for the next chapter of an untold story. His solitude was first interrupted by a pair of joggers. Their sneakers crunched against the gravel as they slowed near him, their conversation fading into tense whispers. One, a middle-aged man with a fitness tracker, glanced at Keanu with mild disdain. "Should we call someone?" he murmured, his voice just loud enough for Keanu to hear. His companion glanced nervously at Keanu before they hurried on, leaving behind a faint trail of unease. Not long after, a group of teenagers rode by on bikes, their laughter echoing through the park. One of them spotted Keanu and slowed to a halt, gesturing for the others to follow. "Yo, you homeless or something?" the boy taunted, his voice dripping with mockery. Keanu's expression remained serene, his gaze unwavering, encouraged by his silence. The boy pressed on. "What happened? Lose your house playing video games?" His friends snickered, one of them pulling out a phone to record. Keanu finally spoke, his tone calm but resolute. "You should move along," he said. There was no threat in his words, but the quiet authority in his voice was enough to make the teens pause, before they could decide whether to stay or leave. The unmistakable sound of a police cruiser broke the tension. The group scattered, their laughter dissolving as quickly as their courage. Officer Martinez stepped out of the car, his sharp gaze locking onto Keanu. "You again," he said, striding toward the bench. "Couldn't find another park to loiter in?" Keanu didn't flinch. Is sitting on a bench a crime now? He asked, his voice steady. Martinez bristled, his hand instinctively resting on the baton at his hip. You've got a smart mouth. Good thing I'm not here to make friends. Keanu replied, his tone even but firm. Officer Higgins joined them, his expression weary. What's the problem here? He asked, glancing between his partner and Keanu. Why are we back? I don't trust him, Martinez muttered, his eyes never leaving Keanu. He's up to something. He's sitting on a bench, Higgins said, exasperated. Let it go. But Martinez wasn't ready to drop it. What's in the bag? He demanded. Keanu picked up the paper bag and handed it over without a word. Inside were a sandwich, an apple, and a bottle of water. Martinez frowned, his suspicion unshaken. You got anything else? He pressed. I've got nothing to hide, Keanu said, his calm demeanor unbroken. But if you're looking for trouble, you won't find it here. Higgins sighed heavily. Let him be, he said, turning back toward the cruiser. But Martinez lingered, his instincts gnawing at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Keanu than met the eye. As Keanu resumed his seat on the bench, the paper bag by his side once again, the tension hung in the air. A silent challenge unspoken but deeply felt. The air between them felt electric, heavy with tension that seemed to grow thicker with every passing second. Keanu Reeves sat still on the bench, his posture relaxed but composed, as though he were untouchable. Officer Martinez, however, wasn't buying it. The man's calm demeanor, his steady gaze, it all felt like a subtle provocation, and it set Martinez on edge. You're awfully calm for someone under this much scrutiny, Martinez said, his voice sharp and laced with suspicion. Most people in your situation might be a little more nervous. Keanu didn't blink. Most people aren't breaking any laws, he replied smoothly. Are you suggesting I should be nervous? Martinez's jaw tightened. He stepped closer, his hand hovering over the baton at his hip. I'm saying you act like you've got nothing to lose, he said, his tone heavy with implication. Makes me wonder what you're hiding. Keanu's gaze didn't waver. I've got nothing to hide, he said evenly. You've already searched me. Search my bag. If you're still looking for something, that's on you. From a few feet away, Officer Higgins sighed audibly, one hand resting on the cruiser's door. Let's go, he called to his partner, his voice tinged with irritation. The guy's not doing anything wrong. But Martinez ignored him. His eyes narrowed as he studied Keanu, searching for a crack in his composure. You've got an answer for everything, don't you? He muttered, frustration bleeding into his tone. Think you're smarter than me? Keanu tilted his head, his expression unflinching. I'm not trying to prove anything, he said calmly. I'm just sitting on a bench. Martinez stepped closer, the tension between them nearly tangible. You think you're clever, don't you? He hissed. Like you can just sit there and make me look like an idiot? Keanu's voice remained calm, but there was a quiet edge to it. I think you're doing that all by yourself, he said. That was enough to make Higgins intervene. He stepped between his partner and Keanu, his expression firm. That's it, Higgins said sharply. We're done here. Martinez's frustration boiled over. No, we're not, he snapped. This guy's playing us. I can feel it. Feel it all you want, Higgins said, his tone growing more forceful. You don't have anything on him. Let it go. For a moment, it seemed like Martinez might argue, but then he stepped back, his hand reluctantly dropping from his baton. Fine, he muttered through clenched teeth. We go. Keanu remained silent, his eyes steady as he watched the two officers retreat toward their cruiser. But as Martinez reached the car, he hesitated, glancing back over his shoulder. For a brief moment, their eyes met. An unspoken challenge passed between them, one that neither man was willing to articulate, but both could feel. Inside the car, Higgins shook his head as he started the engine. You've got to let this stuff go, he said tiredly. It's not worth the trouble. Martinez stared out the window, his jaw tight. It's not about trouble, he muttered. It's about respect. That guy thinks he's untouchable. Higgins sighed as the cruiser rolled onto the main road. He's not untouchable, he said. We've just got better things to do. But Martinez couldn't shake it. His mind churned with unanswered questions. Who was this guy? Why did he act like he had nothing to fear? And why? Despite the lack of evidence, did Martinez feel like Keanu was hiding something? Keanu Reeves sat on the park bench, calm and composed, his serene demeanor standing in sharp contrast to the rising tension. Across from him, Officer Martinez paced, his suspicion simmering just below the surface. "You're awfully calm," Martinez said, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Most people wouldn't be so relaxed under scrutiny." Keanu didn't flinch. "Most people aren't breaking the law," he replied evenly. "Am I supposed to act guilty for sitting on a bench?" Martinez's jaw tightened as he took a step closer. "You act like you've got nothing to lose," he said, his tone laced with accusation. "That makes me wonder what you're hiding." "I'm hiding nothing," Keanu replied, his voice steady. "You've checked my ID, searched my bag. If you're still looking for something, maybe it's your own doubts you need to investigate." Officer Higgins sighed heavily, standing by the cruiser. "Enough," he said, his tone edged with weariness. "We've got nothing on him. Let's move on." But Martinez wasn't ready to drop it. His narrowed eyes stayed fixed on Keanu. "You've got an answer for everything, don't you?" he snapped. "Think you're smarter than me?" "I'm not trying to prove anything," Keanu said, leaning back slightly, "just enjoying the park." Martinez stepped closer, the tension thickening with each movement. "You think you can just sit here, looking smug, and make me look like a fool?" he growled. Keanu's voice remained calm, though it carried a quiet weight. "If you feel foolish, officer, that's not something I can control." Higgins stepped in, placing a hand on Martinez's shoulder. "That's enough," he said firmly. "This isn't worth it." But Martinez refused to back down. He grabbed his radio, calling for a background check on the name provided earlier. As the radio crackled back with no matches found, Martinez's frustration boiled over. "This guy's lying," he muttered, glaring at Keanu. "That ID is fake." Keanu tilted his head, his calm gaze meeting Martinez's. "If it's fake, why didn't you catch it before?" he asked, his tone neutral but cutting. Higgins finally intervened, his voice firm and unyielding. "We're done here. Let it go before you make things worse." Reluctantly, Martinez stepped back, his glare never leaving Keanu as Higgins steered him toward the cruiser. "This isn't over," Martinez muttered, slamming the car door behind him. Keanu watched them leave, his expression unreadable. As the cruiser disappeared, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small device, examining it briefly before slipping it back. A faint smile crossed his lips, almost imperceptible, as he leaned back on the bench. The pieces were falling into place, just as he had anticipated. Keanu Reeves sat quietly on the bench, his posture relaxed, the late afternoon sunlight casting long shadows across the park. His calm demeanor was unwavering as Officer Martinez approached, his steps deliberate and charged with tension. This time, Martinez was alone. His partner, Officer Higgins, had finally had enough, refusing to participate in what he deemed a pointless and escalating confrontation. But Martinez wasn't ready to walk away. For him, this wasn't just an encounter anymore. It was a battle for control, for answers, and perhaps for his own pride. "You've got a lot of nerve," Martinez said, stopping a few feet away, his voice taut with irritation. "Sitting here like you own the place." Keanu looked up, his expression neutral but tinged with a faint hint of curiosity. "It's a public park," he replied evenly. "No one owns it. You know what I mean." Martinez snapped, his frustration bubbling over. "You've been playing games with me all day. I'm done. You're going to tell me who you really are, or I'll make sure you regret it." Keanu tilted his head slightly, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. "You really want to know who I am?" he asked, his tone calm but edged with quiet authority. "No more games," Martinez growled. "Let's see some real ID this time. No tricks, no fake names, just the truth." Keanu's movements were deliberate as he reached into his coat pocket. Martinez's hand instinctively hovered near his baton, his body tensing as he prepared for anything. But instead of producing another ID, Keanu pulled out a sleek black smartphone. Its polished surface gleamed in the sunlight as he held it up. "I don't need to prove anything to you," Keanu said, his voice steady and unyielding. "But since you're so determined to know the truth, I'll let you in on something." He tapped the screen, and a video began to play. Martinez leaned in slightly, his brow furrowing as he focused on the footage. The screen displayed a crystal-clear recording of their earlier interactions. Every word Martinez had spoken, every gesture, every glare. It was all captured in stunning detail. The audio was crisp, leaving no room for ambiguity. "What is this?" Martinez demanded, his voice rising. "This," Keanu said, his tone calm but cutting, "is a live stream. It's been running all day. Every word you've said, every move you've made, it's all been broadcast live." The color drained from Martinez's face, his hand falling limply from his baton. "Broadcast to who?" he stammered. "To millions of people," Keanu replied, slipping the phone back into his pocket. Then, standing to his full height, he added, "I'm not who you think I am. I'm Keanu Reeves." Martinez blinked, the weight of recognition hitting him like a freight train. His mind raced to process the revelation. "You're what? Keanu Reeves? The actor?" Keanu nodded, his gaze unwavering. "And I've been running an experiment, testing how people in positions of power treat those they perceive as powerless." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Martinez's face turned red, his frustration and humiliation mixing in equal measure. "You set me up," he said, his voice trembling with anger. "I didn't set you up," Keanu corrected. "I gave you choices. Every action you took, every word you said, that was all you." Martinez's fists clenched at his sides as he struggled to form a coherent response. "You had no right," he spat. "No right to do this." Keanu's voice remained calm, but there was an undeniable edge of authority. "I had every right. You're a public servant. You swore to protect and serve. But instead, you harassed someone based on your own assumptions." Martinez opened his mouth to argue, but the sound of murmuring drew both their attention. A crowd had begun to gather, phones raised, their cameras capturing the unfolding scene. News crews had arrived, reporters whispering into microphones as they pointed toward the confrontation. The realization hit Martinez like a tidal wave. He had gone from the enforcer to the center of a public spectacle. His voice cracked as he pointed an accusatory finger at Keanu. "You think this makes you a hero?" he shouted. "You're nothing but a fraud, dressing up and playing games." "This isn't about me," Keanu said, his tone measured but firm. "It's about accountability. It's about how people in power treat others when they think no one is watching." The crowd murmured in agreement, their phones capturing every word. Martinez's desperation was palpable as he glanced around, realizing just how far the situation had spiraled out of his control. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice shaking as he stormed back to his cruiser. Keanu watched him go, his expression calm yet resolute. The crowd began to applaud softly, their cheers growing louder as they realized the significance of what had just happened. The murmurs of disbelief and outrage among the crowd had grown to a rumble that vibrated through Central Park. The air was thick with tension as Officer Higgins arrived, his face pale, his steps hurried. He'd been following the escalating scene from the cruiser, but seeing it unfold before him was another matter entirely. Keanu Reeves stood by the fountain, his posture calm but commanding. Cameras from news crews zoomed in on him, while phones in the crowd captured every word and movement. The world was watching. Higgins pulled Officer Martinez aside, gripping his arm firmly. "Stop talking," he whispered harshly. "You're making it worse." Martinez's face burned with frustration. "I'm not letting him get away with this," he hissed. But Higgins tightened his grip, his voice heavy with resignation. "You already did," he said quietly. "Just stop before you dig this hole any deeper." The crowd's voices grew louder, filled with condemnation. Words like abuse of power and disgrace rippled through the gathering. Reporters spoke animatedly into their microphones. Their broadcast words carried live to millions. Meanwhile, Keanu turned his attention to the crowd. his voice steady and resonant. "This isn't about one officer," he began, his tone carrying the weight of truth. "It's about a system that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked. Accountability isn't just about actions, it's about attitudes." Applause erupted, reverberating through the park. Martinez stood frozen, his face pale and his composure cracking under the weight of public scrutiny. He glanced at the cameras and the crowd, realizing every move he made was being captured and dissected. "I didn't do anything wrong," Martinez muttered weakly. "I was just doing my job." Keanu's gaze sharpened. "Your job is to serve and protect, not to profile, harass, or abuse your authority," he said, his voice cutting through the noise like a knife. "If you can't handle that responsibility, then maybe you shouldn't wear the badge." Higgins stepped in again, his tone pleading. "Let's just go," he urged Martinez. "This isn't worth it." Before they could retreat, a commanding voice cut through the chaos. "Officers, stand down." The crowd parted as a woman approached, her tailored suit and composed demeanor exuding authority. The badge on her belt identified her as Captain Jane Monroe from Internal Affairs. Her sharp eyes locked onto Martinez, whose defiance melted into apprehension. "You've made quite a mess," Monroe said coldly, her voice devoid of sympathy. "I hope you're prepared to deal with the consequences." "Ma'am, Martinez began, but Monroe raised a hand, silencing him. "Save it," she snapped. "I've seen the footage, and the public has made their opinion pretty clear." She gestured to the crowd, now openly booing Martinez. Turning to Keanu, her tone softened slightly. "Mr. Reeves," she said, "on behalf of the department, I'd like to apologize for what you've endured. This behavior is unacceptable, and it will be addressed." Keanu nodded, his expression calm but resolute. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Monroe turned back to Martinez, her voice sharp. "Hand over your badge and weapon." "What?" Martinez stammered, his face draining of color. "You can't be serious." "Do it," she commanded, her tone brooking no argument. "You're on administrative leave, pending an investigation, and trust me, it will be thorough." Martinez's hands trembled as he unclipped his badge and holster, his face a portrait of utter defeat. The crowd, sensing justice inching forward, erupted into cheers, a wild mix of relief and vindication. It was as though every voice in Central Park collectively declared, "Finally, someone's doing something." And poor Martinez? He was escorted away like a child caught with his hand in the cookie jar. Keanu, ever composed, turned to the cameras, his expression both calm and resolute. "This isn't the end," he declared, his voice carrying the weight of the moment. "It's just the beginning. If we want real change, we need to hold people accountable, not just when they're caught, but every single day." The applause that followed wasn't just loud, it was deafening. It echoed through the park, drowning out even the whispers of shock among the onlookers. Keanu stood near the fountain, his hands tucked casually into his coat pockets. To an outsider, he might have looked like a man waiting for his coffee order, but the air around him crackled with the gravity of what had just unfolded. This wasn't just another day. This was a moment etched in time. Captain Monroe approached, her professional demeanor tempered by a hint of sincerity. "Mr. Reeves," she began, her tone steady but respectful, "I want to personally assure you this will be investigated thoroughly. The department doesn't tolerate behavior like this." Keanu nodded, his voice quiet yet unyielding. "I hope that's true," he said, "because this isn't about one officer. It's about the culture that allows this behavior to thrive." His words hung in the air, their weight palpable. Monroe hesitated, visibly shaken by his directness. "I understand," she said after a pause, "and I'll make sure your concerns are heard." She walked away, her stride measured but her mind clearly racing. Keanu returned to the bench, his sanctuary of quiet rebellion. Pulling out his phone, he scrolled through the comments pouring into his live stream. Words of outrage, support, and hope flooded the screen. "This is why we need accountability," one commenter wrote. "Keanu Reeves just exposed a huge problem," another added. Nearby, An elderly woman cautiously approached, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped her purse. "I didn't know who you were," she admitted, her voice quivering. "But what you did today, it's brave." Keanu's hardened expression softened as he looked at her. "Sometimes, to understand a problem, you have to experience it firsthand," he said. "And sometimes, the only way to fix it is to shine a light on it." Her eyes welled with tears of gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, "for standing up for all of us." Keanu nodded, his gaze following her as she walked away, her steps a little lighter than before. Meanwhile, Martinez's day had gone from bad to worse. Stripped of his authority and dignity, he sat in the back of a police cruiser, his head buried in his hands. The weight of his actions pressed down on him like the world's heaviest anchor. Nearby, Monroe and her team reviewed the footage, their expressions grim as they pieced together the evidence of his misconduct. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across Central Park, Keanu stood and stretched, his presence as unassuming as ever. A sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb, its engine humming softly. His assistant stepped out, holding the door open. "Ready to go, sir?" they asked. Keanu hesitated, his gaze sweeping over the park. The chaos had subsided, leaving behind an air of quiet reflection. He pulled a pen and a scrap of paper from his pocket, scribbling a quick note. Walking back to the bench, he tucked the note under its edge. Before stepping into the car, he turned one last time, his eyes lingering on the crowd, the officers, and the bench where it all began. "This isn't just about me," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "It's about making sure everyone has a seat at the table or the bench." As the SUV pulled away, the note fluttered in the gentle breeze, its message clear and simple. "To the next person who sits here, your story matters. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The day's events didn't just go viral, they became a rallying cry. Conversations about accountability, justice, and respect ignited across social media, news outlets, and dinner tables. Keanu's quiet but impactful stand reminded everyone that sometimes, all it takes is one person refusing to look the other way to spark real change.